on behalf of my co-organiser, Emma Graham, I welcome you all to this conference on parenting and work in a post-COVID context, hosted by the ANU College of Law at the Australian National University, with the support of the Australian Public Service. On behalf of the College, I would like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands the Australian National University is situated, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I acknowledge that their lands were never ceded. I would particularly like to acknowledge and welcome the Indigenous peoples attending the conference, including several esteemed Indigenous speakers today. During this conference, we aim to explore the challenges and contradictions arising from the intersection of parenting and paid work. While labour market inequality arising from the gendered norms of caregiving and parenting is not novel, COVID-19 and its variants has accentuated its inequality and its contradictions, not just in regard to gender, but also in terms of the intersection of gender with race, class, disability, and sexuality. Before I ask Professor Wheeler to open the conference, let me mention a few quick housekeeping rules. This webinar will be recorded, so that ensure that your microphone is on mute, that the chat function has been disabled, and if you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Sally Wheeler, who's Deputy Vice-Chancellor, International Strategy at the ANU and Dean of the ANU College of Law, to formally open the conference. Over to you, Professor Wheeler.
Thank you very much, Professor Thornton. I'm delighted to be invited to open this conference, and perhaps I could also begin by acknowledging and celebrating the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal Ngambri people, and also for colleagues joining us from around Australia and across the world, point out that sovereignty has never been ceded. This is, and always will be, Aboriginal land, and that these are live and pressing debates which should be things that we are talking about in contemporary Australia. So I'd like to congratulate Margaret and Emma Graham for pulling this conference together today and for putting on a fantastic programme. I'd also like to particularly welcome our keynote speaker, Commissioner June Oscar, who joins us from Broome. Commissioner Oscar is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and I am delighted that you can join us today, June. We will hear from some of the best minds across ANU today, representing various colleges and centres, the ANU School of Politics and International Relations, the Research School of Population Health, Crawford School of Public Policy, and obviously our own College of Law. We're also delighted that the Attorney General's Department will be represented this afternoon. Martin Hehir, who is a DepSec in that department, will be joining us. This conference highlights really important issues. Besides the question of will things ever be the same again after COVID, I guess we should be asking whether we want them to be the same again. Certainly, the pandemic has highlighted issues of class, huge issues of inequality that perhaps we thought were not present in our societies, only present in other people's. The plight of sole carers. Those, for example, who cannot work within the home, have to work outside the home, often for very low wages. These are pressing challenges. The whole fabric of our society is being re-engineered. Coming from Europe, the 24/7 supply chain is a huge issue. And yet, I wonder how many of us have given thought to the working conditions and how people who participate in that structure their working lives to get my Amazon delivery to me the next day. And that's, I think the pandemic has forced us to reflect on those issues, and we need to find new ways forward that can both not just accommodate but also value every aspect of people's lives. And so I'm now, without further ado, going to hand over to Commissioner Oscar.
Thanks very much, Professor Wheeler, for your inspiring words. As Professor Wheeler said, we're going to move now to the keynote address to be delivered by the Commissioner June Oscar of the Australian Human Rights Commission. And to introduce her formally, I'm passing on the baton to someone far better qualified than I am, and that is Ms. Jennifer Collard of the National Indigenous Australians Agency Task Force, who, among her many other roles, advises upon and develops strategic partnerships across the Commonwealth Public Service. Thank you, Ms. Collard.
Thank you very much, and what a privilege. And I'm an Aboriginal lady from the Northern Territory, but most of my career have been in WA, and have kind of grown up in my public sector in awe of June Oscar. So when I was asked by the ANU to introduce June, what a privilege. So thank you very much. Now it's all about June. June is up as early as I am with our 3-hour difference, and looking spectacular like usual. June AO is a proud Bunyama woman from the remote town of Fitzroy Crossing in West Australian Kimberley region. She's a strong advocate of Indigenous Australian languages, social justice, women's issues, and worked tirelessly to reduce fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is known as FASD, and most famous for. June has had a raft of influential positions, including Deputy Director of the Kimberley Land Council, Chair of the Kimberley Language Resource Centre and the Kimberley Interpreting Service, and a Chief Investigator with WA's Lillywam project addressing FASD. She was appointed to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commissioner in 1990 and was a winner of the 100 Women of Influence 2013 in the Social Enterprise and Not-for-Profit category. In 2015, June received the Menzies School of Health Research Medallion for her work in FASD. June has a bachelor degree in business from the University of Notre Dame, Broome, Western Australia, and is currently writing her PhD. June is a co-founder of the Yiramalay Wesley Studio School and is a community member of the Fitzroy Valley Futures Governing Committee. It's a fantastic program if anybody wants to check that one out. In February 2017, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Edith Cowan University. June was also named the NAIDOC Person of the Year at the 2018 National NAIDOC Awards. And in 2019, she was bestowed the honorary role of the Distinguished Fellow of ANZ SOG. June began her 5-year term at the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner on the 3rd of April 2017. So I welcome June, and it's a pleasure to facilitate this session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is early here in WA for Jennifer and I. But thank you, Margaret, Sally, Emma, and everyone for pulling this together and for extending the invitation to me to participate in this very important discussion. It is with absolute pleasure to be speaking to you all today. My name's June Oscar, and I am Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, the first Aboriginal woman in the role in 25 years. Just getting a little notification to lower my hand, which I didn't put up. Okay. As Jennifer mentioned, or Sally. I'm joining you from the lands of the Yarru people here in Broome, Western Australia, a region that's just been hammered by wet season rains, incredible flooding, a time of the year that everyone looks forward to, good fishing, good hunting season. Life is good for everyone up here at this time, mostly. So I'm speaking on this critical topic, and thank you for inviting me to take part here. And for conferences such as this, where themes of parenting and care are discussed, I like to give thanks to our powerful matriarchs, our First Nations matriarchs, particularly, who carry the knowledge of nurture and have birthed and raised tens of thousands of our peoples right across this continent. So welcome, everyone. What a big and necessary theme you have all gathered to discuss. I have been asked to talk to these issues confronting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in relation to parenthood and paid work. For me, this is a topic that cannot be considered without the concept of care. To understand what parents, children, families, and our society needs to weather the impacts of COVID and beyond, we have to answer the question, what is care work and how should we value it? In my mind, it is the provision of care, not money, that makes the world go round. Care that nourishes the young and respects and honors the old, that embraces and supports those of all abilities. Care that is the empathy and thoughtfulness, the common neighbourly goodness that knits civil society together. We all know, have been the recipient of, and have enacted this multi-dimensional concept of care. And when it comes to a First Nations conception of care, the interconnecting systems that benefit from care extends to encompass all living things. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people care for country, for culture, for kin, and community. Care is the knowledge we carry and the work we do to ensure a healthy planet from one generation to the next for the benefit of all beings, the human and the non-human. I heard about this broad and meaningful conception of care throughout Wiyaniyu Dangani engagements. Wiyaniyu Dangani meaning women's voices in my Bonobo language. Throughout 2018, we ran the largest national engagement since 1986, with over 2,000 First Nations women and girls across Australia. We heard about their strengths and knowledges, their challenges and solutions across all areas of life. These stories are captured in the landmark Wiyaniyu Dangani 2020 report, my first report as Australia's Social Justice Commissioner, dedicated to First Nations women and girls. What has left a lasting imprint for me from this engagement period, and that continues to characterize the work that we are doing through socializing and implementing Wiyaniyu Dangani, report is the breadth of parenting and care work that our women and girls do, which goes completely undervalued and unrecognized. It is the type of care work that I have described, which keeps everything functioning. It's time-consuming, never-ending hours, takes planning and strategy. It is real labor with incredible far-reaching benefits that we all depend on. But throughout Wiyani Udangani, women and girls consistently spoke to the fact that since colonization, over the centuries and in contemporary times, this work they do and the knowledge they carry has been rendered invisible. As such, systems and structures have been formed that do not value our women's work and fail to recognize our conception of parenthood. Obviously, these dominant systems not only fail to meet the needs of our women and families, but in seeking to force our people to fit within the mainstream, they have caused ongoing harm and trauma. We see this manifest in so many different ways, perhaps the worst of which is the rapidly growing pipeline of First Nations children who have been removed from their families and who, despite many having undiagnosed cognitive disabilities such as fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, are ending up in juvenile detention and then into cycles of recidivism and adult incarceration at a rate that is beyond alarming. This cycle of trauma, entrenched through systems with few effective supports or interventions to remedy it, only serves to deepen the burden of care on our women. This is a burden that has been building since colonization. Exclusion, dispossession, dislocation, injustice, and discrimination have driven a cumulative pattern of inherited poverty and trauma across generations, heightening the need for care, healing, and matriarchal knowledges of nurture and growth, just as surrounding patriarchal structures were built to be unashamedly uncaring, simultaneously undermining of women and our roles, skills, and knowledges. This nation and our society at large has denied the truth of these deeply systemic harms perpetuated by Western societal and economic structures for centuries. What is changing here, in the here and now, is that the global upheaval of the COVID-19 pandemic has brought into plain sight truths that for so long have been denied by those in power and authority. The truth of entrenched institutional inequalities. For many, this crisis has been a wake-up call. And under the added weight of truth-telling from the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, and about the climate emergency we all face, the facade of a system that purported to operate fairly and for the common good has cracked, laying bare the structures that have always been there, undermining us. There are many First Nations experiences throughout the pandemic that are highlighting both the exposure of this truth and the possible shift in the way society wants to function. At the onset of COVID, I returned to my homeland, as so many others did. One of the deepest motivating factors was care. Country felt like the safest and most caring place to be at a time of such great uncertainty. My family and kin were there to provide support for one another, and I had guardian caring responsibilities for children, for elders, and those with disabilities. While travelling home in a complete reversal of decades of public policy that was seeking to withdraw support from our communities, governments acknowledged almost immediately the incredibly vulnerable position First Nations people were in. Because of severe underinvestment in community infrastructure, our communities have horrendous conditions of overcrowding and many underlying health issues. The worst conditions for COVID to take hold. The return of our peoples to homelands during this time further highlighted this underinvestment as a rapidly growing population put huge pressure on scarce resources and services. Many communities have only limited health and social services supports, often lacking things others take for granted, such as the availability of children's daycare services, where there should have been long-term investment in local skills, health and social infrastructure. Fly-in, fly-out services have been provided instead. In response to this now all too visible crisis, the measures taken by the government in March 2020, including JobKeeper, the introduction of the coronavirus supplement, cessation of mutual obligations requirements, and free childcare constituted some of the most significant social and economic measures in recent decades to alleviate poverty in Australia. Research showed that there was a 32% reduction, pardon me, 32% reduction of people living in poverty during the period that these measures were in effect. During this time, I heard from First Nations parents who had, some for the very first time in their lives, had been able to pay for rent and electricity while also regularly putting food on the table for their children and putting fuel in their cars to travel to shops and access essential services. Before the supplement, the combined costs of these activities had been unaffordable, and attempting to make ends meet was the cause of great stress for many financially insecure households. And it was not only adults on income support who benefited from the coronavirus supplement. Children do not exist in isolation. What happens to their families, their parents, and their communities affects them. And their well-being is best protected when those around them have their well-being protected too. These measures are the types of structural supports that acknowledge and begin to remunerate the immense caring work provided by women and parents, understanding that supporting parents and families to be able to care for one another brings innumerable social, cultural, and economic generations benefits. While the introduction of these measures demonstrated that swift and decisive action could be taken to alleviate poverty, that they have not been sustained, has shown that there is still a blockage in transitioning policy beyond crisis response into a model of sustained investment into communities. Likewise, there appears to be an ongoing reluctance to accept the lack of merit inherent in punitive policies such as work for the dole schemes that do not reflect wages and benefits at the minimum award rate, or compulsory programs for parents so as to badger them back into the workforce, even when there are no local jobs available. Overall, it is clear that the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 have been borne unequally. Evidence from the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey in May 2020 showed that the approximately 3.5 million people employed in the industries most impacted by the economic shutdown in response to COVID-19 were low-wage workers and disproportionately female and or young. The survey did not record details about ethnicity, but international research in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom has shown that people of colour are significantly overrepresented in the sectors most affected by the pandemic. Furthermore, where the government invested in industries amidst the pandemic, it was overwhelmingly in male-dominated sectors. This is despite evidence that investment in many of the industries and sectors that women are employed in can contribute greatly to a nation's economic growth. In particular, we know that care work for children, those with disability, and the elderly are growth sectors that largely employ women. The evidence also tells us that women's economic empowerment is correlated with improved health and educational outcomes for children, as well as reductions in gender-based violence. That is why, as one of the country's most disadvantaged and marginalised groups, and one of its greatest untapped resources, First Nations women must sit at the centre, not at the margins of our strategy for economic recovery. We must invest in their potential, their skills and knowledges, which have been neglected for far too long, to the detriment of all Australians. So my engagements with First Nations women reaffirm that we are resilient. There is no doubt we have a remarkable capacity to survive, but we want more than just survival. We want to heal beyond trauma and restore family and community bonds and societal-wide health and well-being. We have had enough of being ignored and of taking part in processes that are limited to tweaking fundamentally flawed systems that have failed to alleviate the disadvantage we experience. We must seize the opportunity to emerge from the pandemic with new systems across the board, including but not limited to the way we think about, do, and are remunerated for care work, and the priority we give and resources we provide for the well-being and care of our families and communities. With care at the heart of our economic structures, we will see reformed social security systems that ensures an economic base that enables parents and carers to raise families free from poverty and that keeps women and children safe and together. We will also see sustained investment in culturally appropriate care infrastructure and supports, redistributing the burden on First Nations women at the same time as offering training and paid opportunities to pursue care work. Women spoke about wanting formal opportunities, formal opportunities to carry out the care work they are already doing, whilst many spoke of the need for additional supports to enable them to participate and engage in social and economic spaces in ways that meet their goals and aspirations. And the evidence tells us that if we invest in First Nations business, and particularly those run by our women, they are 100 times more likely to employ First Nations people and develop these types of culturally safe, flexible workplace structures that support meaningful work as well as valuing care and parenthood. Ultimately, our economic empowerment cannot be just about fitting into the mainstream. It must be about designing our own economic base that can bring about the social, cultural, political future we all want. We know that when recognized and supported by the structures and the world around us, the strengths of people and communities can be harnessed to create positive change. Through We Yaniu Dangani Women's Voices project, First Nations women and girls have a powerful mechanism to convey and progress their vision for the future. As I mentioned earlier, we are now in the third stage of the project, a key element of which will be a national First Nations Women and Girls Summit to be held in the first half of 2023. In preparation for dialogues at the summit, the We Yaniu Dangani implementation framework, which we will be releasing this week, will be built upon through further research conducted with partner organisations and ongoing discussions with communities and other stakeholders in the lead up to the summit. The implementation framework is a follow-up to the report, translating the major findings into priorities and actions. The implementation framework identifies 24 actions spanning 9 priority areas, which sit leadership and decision making, or sit under 4 key themes rather. These are women and girls leadership and decision making, language, law, culture and knowledge systems belonging to women, healing approaches to breaking intergenerational trauma, and economic justice and empowerment, which holds a particular focus on unpaid work and care responsibilities that women carry, and has as its key priority areas control over income and financial resources, engagement in meaningful economies, and a transformed care economy. One of our significant partners is the ANU, who will help us explore some of these actions, in particular the breadth and extent of First Nations women's unpaid care work. I encourage everyone participating today to read the framework, which will be available on our website by the end of this week. And before I leave you, will share the vision statement for the thematic area, economic justice and empowerment. Our skills, knowledges and work are recognised, valued and understood as central to the functioning of Australia's economy. Economic systems and policies are structured around a deep understanding of and value for the care we provide our families, our communities, and our countries, so as to enable a sustainable economic system that guarantees our financial security and shrinks inequality so that no one lives in poverty. Women are in control of the financial decisions and resources in our own lives and are empowered to develop and lead vibrant local economies where profit stays circulating across our regions for the benefit of our communities and our countries. Economic justice and empowerment for First Nations women and girls is a vehicle through which we are secure and supported to lead the lives we value. Not only does our economic justice benefit us, it benefits entire communities, men, women, girls and boys, and senior people. Our sustainable economies provides significant wealth and well-being for everyone, leaving no one excluded or marginalized. Thank you, and Yaninja.
Thank you, June. That was absolutely amazing, like usual, especially so early in the morning. So I'm with you. I'm drinking coffee, and that was amazing. So thank you very, very much. What we've got to do, we've got approximately half an hour, and to allow the participants on this webinar to ask you some questions, if that's okay. So I'm going to open it up to all the participants. There's, by my computer, it's 48 participants. Please welcome you to Q&A. I've got a Q&A button at the end. At this moment, there's no questions. So please, has anybody got a question that they would like to ask June?
Hi, Jenny. Maybe just while we're waiting for people to type into the Q&A function, is it okay if I ask a question? Because as a host, I can't type it in. So first of all, I'd just like to thank you both, and thank you in particular, June, for your keynote address and for your report. It really struck me today, and also reading Wiyani Utangani, that there are so many intersections between different areas of policy that relate to work. When I was reading your report, I thought we so often think about parenting and work. Well, I suppose, first of all, we think about work in isolation from care, and that's a theme, but also we think about work in isolation from things like housing, overcrowding, homelessness, or in isolation from health. Or, you know, so many other things that go on in people's lives. And I just wondered whether or not you think that, we know, when we develop policy, we do think about it in isolation, or whether or not we could better address those intersections in our thinking and our policy development.
Absolutely. I agree that all too often we aren't working in a intersecting, joined up way when we're considering all of these issues. And the experience is that we struggle, those policymakers and those who are guiding investments into well-intentioned and meaning areas, but they're absolutely missing an opportunity to work in that intersecting way, in that holistic way, that would be a far better use of resources, and would impact the change and support the change that we're wanting to see addressed in our community settings, in our lives. So there's real missed opportunities here to work in the intersecting way. And we understand that systems are designed to operate in the siloed way. They totally miss the point of the fact that these are human lives the issues are real, and how can we best tailor the policies in such a way that we recognize humanity of each and every one of us. Systems fail to do that, fail to acknowledge that. And we are mere numbers. We are merely a problem to be solved. I think it's time. And I think one of the positives around the new ways of working during COVID is that people have been able to go to work, but be at home, attend to matters in the household, to care for themselves as well, but being very productive in that arrangement. And I think there's something real there for us to explore in terms of what do we mean by going to work? Because for many First Nations people in communities, people are always in community and people are always working. Caring work is across the day, every night. There's no switch off button. So now's the time to be really having the real, truthful conversation around care work, how we support it, how we can do better in terms of acknowledging people's humanity and intersecting across policy areas so that, look, it's time we move away from the siloed approach, the siloed thinking, and often policy designers are not living in the reality that programs and policies that who they're targeted to. So we want accountability, we want transparency, we want people with the skills, the knowledge, the expertise, and the willingness to work in a different way in supporting those who are providing care to many, many others in our communities across the country.
Thank you, June. There's still a bit of a slow uptake. So can I ask a question while I'm waiting for all these people? I love some of the statements you've written. I've written them down and I'm thinking, wow, I love this one about the provision of care, not money. Do you want to explain to the audience what that means, kind of a lens in the Indigenous community, how we would see it? Because when you're sitting in Canberra, for example, doing policy or in large capital cities, you don't actually understand what that means in community. Can you just explore that comment in community for us, please?
Well, I'm sure, good question. I'm sure, this is because of the value that First Nations people place on the things that matter. Families matter. Carrying responsibilities, transferring knowledge through our knowledge systems was a practice, still is a practice that has been with us long before money and object came into our lives, and systems that were introduced to our already existing systems of value. Our value on non-monetary objects, the value placed on relationships, the value placed on our responsibility and our knowledge and our understanding was far more important and one who is able to understand and transfer knowledge to ensure that generations of people carried their responsibilities from time immemorial to eternity is of more value than money. But I acknowledge that we live in this new reality where money has become a critical feature in our lives. From a history of the introduction of paid work by the colonizers, many First Nations people never, ever received any monetary benefit for their labor. And I lived in a time where, as a kid, we'd line up with our parents to receive the rations. So the rations of tea, flour, sugar, fabric, tobacco. I saw that. That was in my lifetime. That payment to those who worked, through blood, sweat, tears, hard work, and paid in food. To a time now where there's social security benefits that came into the lives of people, and how that created a different set of issues for our people, to the reduction, the opportunity in the reduction of employment opportunities, to people needing to enroll or register for Social Security. Again, in my lifetime, I saw my people coming off cattle stations and lining up at the native welfare office to sign up for social service. And that was to, a time when people referred to it as sit-down money. But the care and love and support for families and communities of people during that upheaval still continued. And our people found ways of how to provide. Now that we weren't living out bush on country, we were now living on little fenced off areas known as reserves, like refugees in our own country, with no housing, just army surplus tents. The understanding around the value of money when it was introduced is a very important story, is a very important narrative in our country, and how it came into our lives. And today we now hear of wealthy people making decisions around whether or not we can be trusted with money. Hence the cashless debit card. I mean, the lack of investment into the underlying causal factors that would make a huge difference in the lives of many Indigenous Australians through the advocacy and the design of strategies that are developed in these communities through community organisations with the solutions are still not being listened to. So the system needs to change. The thinking needs to change. Those who are designing the policies that direct and guide the investments from government, they have to stop doing business as they are doing and recognize that we have been denied a place at the table to design our solutions. We have not chosen to be marginalized. We didn't choose that. We didn't choose to be living in poverty in our own country. We didn't choose to be the most disadvantaged groups, the most discriminated group, the dispossessed and the oppressed group in our own country. The systems that are in place uphold those attitudes that the other dominating group knows better than us our own lives. That has got to change.
Thank you, June. You've inspired some of the participants, so a few questions have come on. So thank you very much for that. I'll read out the question and I'll read it really slow. Thank you very much for your words. This is the question. Can you talk to some of the challenges associated with getting workplaces, including public sector workplaces, to understand caring responsibilities and responsibilities to community outside the nuclear family, and how we move forward with this? A bit of a well-pieced, but it's a great question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Our responsibilities, our existence, our lives are premised on a set of rules within our world as Indigenous peoples. So the fabric of life sits upon our customary law, our laws that were created, and many groups would say in the time of creation, the rules were set for us. So we are informed in terms of our lives, our responsibilities. One of the key threads in that fabric is the caring responsibility, obligation we have to our children, to our senior people, in how we live, the distribution of food, the heeding of advice, the lessons of life that are taught. If someone has a responsibility for all of those strands that help us in our development, our growth, not just our physical growth, but our growth in our knowledge and understanding throughout life. So that investment by so many people into our knowledge and understanding is provided on the basis that we then become transferring that knowledge. So we share that across the generations, and that practice has been within our societies from time immemorial. Who you are, what's important, how to be, all of the protocols, your own conduct. These were taught and shared in the oral tradition. None of this is written down or was written down. It was taught, it was practiced, it was what people lived by, these rules. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. Mm.
And, you know, that was the collective practice that everyone carried. Every single human being within our nations of people right across this continent carried that knowledge and understanding. Care provision was paramount in the world of our peoples then and is now. But there's so many influencing factors that challenges individuals now, that is distracting, that gives rise to the inability to address some of these issues on a personal level, on a partner level, at a family level. But they are not those support spaces that can help people deal with that in the way that they need to, because we're preoccupied with different sets of KPIs. I think I've gone away from your question too. So the priorities are different, and I think we need to feel confident that we can raise this in a conversation now, because COVID has really revealed and placed in front of every single one of us in Australia and the world the need for care and how that care is delivered, what it is to care. And for a moment there, governments in our country was able to respond to supporting people to provide the care and the safety and protection that was needed. But I think we're quickly slipping back into old practice. So the challenge for all of us is, how do we maintain what we evidence, what we witness in the COVID pandemic time, that where, one example, where First Nations people were living above the poverty line for the first time in Australia.
Thank you, Jane. That's fantastic. We've got another question for early morning. We're giving you all these questions. So the participant has said, this has been a fantastic presentation that I have enjoyed immensely. I have not had a chance to read the report, but I will now. But I'd love to hear more from June on the aspirations the First Nation girls she talked about to have for their future. How do they see being able to care for their families, community, country as they grow up? Good question.
Good question. Thank you for that. First Nations girls were just incredible. The ones we met with face to face, and the ones that sent in video clips and other ways that they inputted into the report. They are courageous and they are determined to own their space. They spoke about the main contributing element of in terms of their confidence and their ability to achieve and be the incredible young women they are, they attributed that to their family, their culture, their country, and their kinfolk. All of our First Nations girls had, that common story that I am strong because of my grandmother. I am strong because of what she's taught me. I'm strong because of Auntie, etc. And many of them are wanting to continue into their adult life and represent. They're determined. They want action, and they're going to create so many. They're going to achieve and create and continue to smash the glass walls and ceilings. We need to create the space and to become accessible to them. As older women, as supporters, they need to know that we are there. They need to know how to access us. That was one of the key things that some of the young women brought up. We know you're there, we know in our minds that you're there, but we can't see you and we don't know how to access you. So it's important in supporting the growth and development of young people that we walk that talk and that we make ourselves visible as their supporters.
Thank you, June. That was fantastic. We thought we were going early, but those questions have been absolutely fabulous. I will, no more questions, and we'll go to morning tea at 10:15, which is our 7:15, June. So we can have that coffee. I want to thank you very much. It's some of the approaches that you had in your presentation was absolutely amazing. Key things is, it's important that care is going to be investing in care and our women is going to be better, is one of the critical factors for us closing the gap for future. Policy development needs to change. And I think COVID forced us into that, way. And we've just got to build on from what we've learned from the last couple of years during COVID, and hopefully invest in that and build that in the way we're working for all our workplaces. And I know I'm in the public sector, public service, and that's going to be a challenge because it's quite easy to go back to the norm of our system. So I think your presentation and hopefully this conference will advocate and embed some of that learning we've had from the last 2 years to give us a new future. And I think the report is fantastic, and I look forward to supporting that report and participating in that report because it's been absolutely fantastic. And just a bit, this is a privilege for me in my career, actually facilitating June Oscar. So I have to, I'm a Darwin girl and an Adams. So, I've watched you from a very early age. So thank you for the organisers for picking me to do this. And one of my highlights in my career. So thank you, June. I hope to meet you one day, and I'm sure I will when I'm back in Canberra and you're in Canberra. And I've actually loved this morning. So hopefully your presentation, would that be available on the website or?
Yeah, it's recorded, so I think it'll be on the conference website.
Yeah, so we will read that. So fantastic. Thank you very, very much. I've just reminded all the participants. Sorry about that. Remind all the participants we're going to morning tea, and put yourself on mute. Still can stay online, and that's from me. And thank you very much, Margaret. I'm not sure. Are you wanting to say anything? So thank you very much.
Yeah, other than thank you very much. That was a wonderful session, and the report I think was really the most impressive that we've seen in terms of Indigenous people. So thank you, June, and thank you for speaking to us today and starting off our conference. And thank you, Jennifer.
So welcome everyone to this panel session entitled Iterations of Parenthood. My name is Faith Gordon and I'm an Associate Professor at the ANU College of Law, and I acknowledge the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose land this university stands, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded, and I extend this respect and acknowledgement to any Indigenous person participating today or who may listen to the recording after this event. So firstly, special thanks to Emerita Professor Margaret Thornton and Emma Graham for kindly inviting me to chair this wonderful panel of experts and timely presentations this morning. Margaret and Emma, thank you for organising this conference. We all know how much time, effort and preparation that goes into organising these types of events, particularly in COVID-19 times. And you've achieved a really incredible lineup of speakers and papers for us today. This is going to be a day of learning, sharing knowledge, and I'm really looking forward to the insightful discussions in this panel. So each speaker today in this session on iterations of parenthood will speak for around 20 minutes, and we will then have around 30 minutes for our discussion. So if you can please post your questions and comments and observations using the Q&A function, we will really look forward to addressing those in the latter part of the session today. So I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Liz Allen from the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods. And Liz's presentation today draws on her really extensive experience and expertise, and it's entitled Parenting in Australia, Enduring and Emerging Demographies. So thank you, Liz, for your contribution today, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you so much for that, Faith. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me as I get that up. All right, hopefully you can see the screen. Can I get a nod? Excellent. So I got a nod. I got a few thumbs up too. Excellent. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I come to you from my garage on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, and I like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'd also like to particularly shout out to First Nations Australians, people who are participating today and who will be listening to the recording later. I'm presenting today, as Faith introduced, on enduring and emerging demographies within parenting in Australia. COVID has given us quite a gift when it comes to shining a light on and helping us understand almost the plight of families, I think, when it comes to the way that we negotiate our lives, the way that we negotiate things like work, care, paid work, and so on. And so this presentation really gives you a bit of a sense, a teaser for what we know and what we don't know about parents in Australia. And in particular, I'm going to look at some, what I think, important demographies within Australia, within parents. Just a caution before we get started, there's a lot of gendered language within this presentation, and that reflects data. Data determines quite a lot of this presentation insofar as what can be discussed, what can't be discussed, and the bounds around which we talk about parents. Within that also, that notion of gendered language about mums and dads and parents and so on, there are also issues around biology. And in Australia, according to our data, a lot that we know about parents and about families comes down to biology. Again, it's something that the data really constrains us, and something I hope I spark a little bit of a light underneath you to get talking about data and the importance of that when it comes to understanding parents and parenting in Australia. We tend to talk about what we know from data, and certainly our own experiences as parents. I'll give you a disclaimer. I am a parent. I am a mother of 7 children. And so a lot of my experiences certainly drive my interest in data. But when it comes to what we talk about, it's the data and experiences that shape the lens by which we consider families and parenting. Rarely do we sit back and appreciate what it is we don't know. And we don't know quite a lot, okay? There's a lot that how do we know what we don't know? I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But that comes down to certainly a lot of anecdata, the kind of anecdotes and the stories that we hear on the ground and so on about lived experience. But certainly the data, as more data grows and we get an appreciation of what we do know, it highlights what we don't. Well, what do we know? We do know that families are an enduring source of solidarity and companionship. I like to say that families are one of those things that can be the most comforting, but also sometimes the most destructive things of our lives. Whether we like it or not, we're connected to something, and it's often a family. Families are a dominant and enduring type, household type. If we look down here, we can see that over time, certainly the way we live within households is changing, but families endure. Families within households endure. But if we look at the family types over here, we're seeing that the couple-only family type is most dominant if we look between these different categories of families. And over time, that's projected to increase. So we're going to see a bit of a transformation of what a family means. And that is in part due to Australia's demography. Overall, Australia's population is ageing. We're having fewer children and we're living longer. A question over whether or not having fewer children is a good thing is a conversation for another day. But as a result of our success in living longer, we're seeing an aging demographic that is transforming the structure of our families. What we're going to see into the future is that lone male parent families are set to increase as a proportion. That's because they're starting from a low base. But lone female parent families will still remain the dominant family type in that category. What I really want to get you geared towards today is this idea of hidden families that result due to poor data. And I'm going to touch on my top 3 as we get going. But I want to use this as a bit of a launching pad. And I think it's quite apt for a number of people in the audience, I imagine, will be praising what I'm about to say here. fathers are definitely more involved than ever in caring for children in Australia. And if we have a look over here, we can see that, yes, where, you know, the nature of employment patterns are changing among parents, and so that the juggle is getting probably more fierce as time goes on. But that juggle also means that we're having these conversations, and that's a good thing. What I think is probably most important here, if we look at the data in this bottom figure here, if we look at this top line and the way it trends over time, women are more likely to do the juggle. Women are more likely to amend their work arrangements or seek out paid employment that enables them to care for their children, primarily. So yes, fathers are being more involved. We're having these conversations, but mothers fit work around caring for children. Fathers fit caring around work. And that, I think, is an important lens for us to now consider, that contemporary parenting in Australia is more family inclusive. Now, that might be doing your head a bit of a spin at the moment. What does that mean? Well, that idea of parenting, removing the nature of mum and dad, is more inclusive. It's broader, and it gives us a few opportunities to learn from these contemporary and emerging demographies, to maybe reconsider and reform the nature of parenting overall. So we will see in the future, we're seeing this already, multi-families, multiple families residing in the same household. That's a result, obviously, of need, housing costs and so on, families choosing to reside together. But you'll learn in a moment that that's not new to First Nations Australians. And we don't really see this recognition of multi-families in households and the potential to learn from the shared parenting or caring for children in those circumstances. Similarly, we have the multi-generational families residing in a single household, where they might be related, they may not be. We particularly see this among more ethnically diverse families and, of course, First Nations Australians. But we don't know much about these two types of households. We also don't talk a lot about lone parents who are lone parents by choice. We don't have data on this, and the data really doesn't allow us to explore this. But we know, for example, as IVF closed down, was deemed an elective surgery during COVID, a lot of people realised that perhaps their last opportunity to be a parent was now. And that prompted many people to say, you know what, I don't need a partner. Within that same or similar vein, same-sex parenting, we have so much to learn from same-sex parenting that we just don't know about yet. Similarly, ethnic diversity and mixed partnering, where we're seeing the migration intake reflect a growing diversity of countries of origin. That reflects in our local population in Australia. And then, of course, offspring that may not have come from a particular country, but they have linkages to different ethnic backgrounds that aren't the dominant white in Australia. So data must be more inclusive. And here's why. Let's consider three major trends in family and parenting in Australia. First Nations families, same-sex families, parents, and ethnically diverse parents. These three important family groups, parenting groups, allow us to learn much about gender equality and how we can do families of the future more fairer or fairer. You might be able to hear a garbage truck out the front. I am in the garage. This is the nature of COVID. Let's go with it. And if you can't hear a garbage truck, just believe me, there's one out the front. Where was I? The other important thing about these three groups is they have experienced discrimination. They continue to experience discrimination. And within that, data also is impacted by that. So what do we know about these families, these parents, that offer us quite a grand opportunity to reshape the notion of family and parenthood in Australia? Same-sex parents, there is a more equal division of labour. This idea that someone so-called wears the pants and the other one takes on a mothering role is just not, that doesn't happen in same-sex parents. There are notable differences. Women in same-sex relationships more equally share the division of household labour than male same-sex couples. When it comes to the size of this parent group, male same-sex couples certainly outnumber women same-sex couples, but women, and it's kind of a no-brainer here, women same-sex couples are more likely to have children. That could be as a result of biology. I would say that's totally why it is. And the legal constraints within Australia around having children, if one identifies as in a male same-sex couple. The other thing that really strikes me is that when it comes to the types of families, they tend to be smaller on average among same-sex parents. Again, due to constraints, I would hazard a guess there. We really don't know. And when it comes to the composition of families and whether or not someone is a parent among these couples, the families are perhaps not lived. And that's something that we really need to pay attention from a legal perspective in Australia. Higher level of education and income among these couples. That could be as a result of demography in the age distribution of these couples, the recognition. We're only coming to marriage equality at this stage. But you can see from this slide, there's a lot that we don't know. If we turn now to another group that experiences quite a lot of disadvantage, First Nations parents. They were here first. They had parenting done right. They had parenting that endured the most horrific of circumstances. There's a lot to learn. Indigenous Australians are on average, if we look at the population, much younger. There's a whole suite of issues here that I can't unpack today. But as a result of that, childbearing tends to start younger. And as a result of that expanded window of opportunity to have children, First Nations Australians tend to have more children. Family is a much richer and broader notion among First Nations Australians. We see multi-families and multi-generational families among households. It's something around 3 times more likely among First Nations parents. Now, often that goes with, okay, overcrowding and things like that. And First Nations Australians face a lot of discrimination as a result of the multi-family and the multi-gen households. But there's a lot to learn here. There's a reason we care like this. There's a reason parenting is done that way. The unpaid care economy is much greater among First Nations Australians. The notion of care and whose responsibility it is and so on goes to the heart of that. But we do see a regional difference there. And that could spell an issue around infrastructure. We can't overlook discrimination and racism that adversely impact First Nations Australians when it comes to education, employment, health, and so on. Closing the gap has been slow and really ineffectual. Again, What we know about these families is constrained by data, and we need to learn to correct this. What about the ethnically diverse? Well, ethnic diversity is increasing in Australia. India and China are now the top countries of origin. Recent migrants are on average younger, and so are that prime age of heading into parenthood, or if that's what they're considering. And so that's something that we need to consider as a country, and the burdens we place on particularly migrants working in the labour force and so on. Language isn't really an issue. We need to be cautious about this. Having said that, the average hides quite a lot down below, and there's in excess of 300 language groups and 300 heritage and ancestry groups within Australia when it comes to country of birth, not around First Nations Australians. Religion and cultural norms of ancestry and the acculturation of the new country are associated with childbearing. Birth rates are typically higher among migrant groups, but over time, migrant groups adjust to the local birth rates, and we see a transition over time. There is a difference when it comes to the gender progressiveness or a class system upon which migrants, the country of origin they arrive from, and that does have an impact on the way people parent and the way that people juggle the division of household care and work. Multi-gen and multi-families households are more common among ethnically diverse parents than any other group. And there's a higher level of education and wealth among this group. But discrimination and racism holds quite a lot of ethnically diverse people back. I want to say something that's might be quite jarring for you at first, but Australia lacks parent-focused data collection. You might say, okay, Liz, we've got the Household Income Labour Dynamics in Australia survey. Emma was there. We've got the longitudinal study of Australian children. We've got the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. We've got the Building a New Life in Australia survey. We've got the general social survey, and we've got the census, right? None of that is parent focused. Hilda goes some way to being household focused, but it, by nature being an omnibus survey, there's not an intricate focus on the way that we divide our time, okay? That's problematic. So from all of these various data sources, we can gather information about families and understand COVID impacts and so on. But these data collections don't ask the right questions. Census doesn't ask about sexual orientation. This is where we know most about our families. We don't have an ethnicity question in the census. First Nations families aren't considered in a more holistic sense. They are considered in LSIC, but the sampling's not great. Sample surveys have issues in that they don't cater for, these longitudinal surveys rather, don't include additional input of population groups of interest, like the ones that are most likely to drop out or newer migrants. Something to be mindful of. We formerly did have in Australia, I think it was the Survey of Australian Families, but that ended back in the 90s. We used to have the Time Use Survey, and don't even get me started on the accuracy of that module in the census. It's not highly accurate. We did see during COVID, the Time Use surveys start up again, but we're yet to see the data. I doubt we'll see it before the election. So what I'm wanting to impart here is that we know a lot about families in Australia, but there's a lot that we don't know. And the bits that we don't know is down to data. And what is hiding within that unknown is something quite glorious, because within that, we can gain something quite grand. Raising children is about parenthood, not just motherhood. And to be serious about gender equality among parents means we need to get serious about data collection. Data collection is vital to understanding needs, the enduring and the emerging. And I'll leave you with that.
Thank you so much, Liz, for a fascinating presentation and for pinpointing so much of what we don't know, and also calling really on data collection, reporting and analysis to really evolve as society, changes, as parents and parenting and families change. So thank you so much learning within your presentation. Look forward to picking up on many of those points in the Q&A. Okay, so I'd like to swiftly move on now to our second speaker, who is one of the conference organisers, Emerita Professor Margaret Thornton from the ANU College of Law. And Margaret will draw upon her considerable research and expertise to discuss a really topical topic really of coronavirus, so COVID-19 and the colonisation of private life. So thank you, Margaret, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I reiterate my acknowledgement of the First Peoples, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples, where the ANU is situated, as elaborated upon at the beginning of the conference. I should also mention that my name is not Fiona Jenkins, that Fiona unfortunately became ill when she went to the UK this week, and I've moved in at short notice. So this is my topic, to look at coronavirus, what's happening. So these are the sort of issues that I'm looking at, working at home during lockdown and beyond. What does it all mean? Changes in the nature of work, significance of technology. But I'm particularly interested in this theoretical question of the way that working at home then leads the economy to colonize private life. What is the significance of that? What does it mean for the sphere of intimacy? Oh dear. Sorry, I don't know why people are calling me now. Is it possible to have any relief from work? Can you hear me all right? That wasn't the problem, so all right. And of course, the gender ramifications that we know about. Now, so I am interested in this idea of the economy sort of taking over private life. Now, William Davies wrote in 2014 that we were now seeing a single economic logic in terms of the way the economy, the social sphere and the political sphere then had become really one in terms of the economy. But he didn't include private life. So I think that this is a change that is occurring as a result of working at home, and particularly the significance of COVID. So to illustrate the point, there was a small online survey in 2020 with 260 responses. But already I think we've gone beyond some of those issues. So first of all, public and private, of course, this is a well-known dichotomy within liberal theory, so that the public sphere then was seen to be a sort of superior sphere, privileged over the private sphere and associated with the masculine, surprise, surprise, which meant it had higher status, but it was seen to be the realm of culture, intellectual life, politics, the professions, and generally paid work in the economy, if we think of it about a simple dichotomy there between public and private. So rather than go into the sort of finer elements of civil society. And the private sphere then was traditionally associated with the feminine and unpaid work. And of course, its feminized character can be traced back at least to Aristotle within the Western intellectual tradition. So it's a very old tradition, seen to be the site of reproduction, of course, child raising and caring, food preparation, domestic work, what Hannah Arendt refers to as the sphere of necessity, so that the private sphere seemed to be necessary to actually sustain the public sphere. And so that women engaging in these, in the reproduction and the caring and child raising, then freed men from caring, so that we have, you know, that gender dichotomy as well as the political and social dichotomy between public and private life. Now, of course, we know, and I'm not going into detail here, but during the 19th and 20th centuries, then women struggled then to move at least partially from the private sphere to the public in order to become citizens, participate in the public sphere fully. But at the same time, they were expected to continue their assumption of responsibility for caring and domestic labour. So it was both, which of course has produced some of the contradictions today. By the late 20th century, we find that women were entering the paid workforce in large numbers. Of course, working class women had always worked, but now we find middle class and other women were entering the workforce. And so this idea of temporal flexibility emerged in order for women to accommodate their caring and domestic labour responsibilities. And as temporal flexibility, the term suggests, you know, that there was then choice as to when and where work would be performed. So we know about, you know, part-time casual work, etc. And so that was designed to suit women, not designed to suit men. So, you know, the sort of gendered underpinnings then of temporal flexibility continued to be important despite the contemporary rhetoric. And of course, this idea of temporal flexibility then was assisted by notions of technology, so that women could be I'm sorry, someone's ringing my phone and I can't stop it. So that technology then, the idea of work being portable and flexible, no longer necessary to have a fixed office, that you could go off and work wherever. And I did a project only 2 or 3 years ago, looking at lawyers working, say, in what was called new law, so they could go off to Byron Bay or wherever, live by the beach and work flexibly because the technology allowed this. And so I was able to talk about the notion of the lawyer as the flexible cyborg. Now the cyborg, you know, is sort of half human, half machine. And so we're all sort of connected to our devices. So in a sense, we're all cyborgs, are always being connected. And so, you know, that nature of work has changed completely. And I think it's interesting to note that even before COVID, over 4 million Australian workers regularly worked at home. So it's not something that arose as a result of COVID, but it actually antedates COVID. So that is interesting. So again, you see, I'm interested in how this then throws light upon, or at least poses the question of what is the significance then of the public-private dichotomy? Where has intimate life gone? Where is the space for that? And this is also illustrated by the survey that I undertook. And so that we know in 2020, wasn't that long ago, although it seems a long time ago, that all non-essential workers with a computer and internet connection were directed to work at home. And Fiona Jenkins did write about the idea of the employer's home then being requisitioned by employers, so that you could see then the economic dimensions there. It was to the advantage of the employer then to have employees working at home and providing, of course, the infrastructure, usually, you know, the computer and the internet connection, paying for the heating and so on at home. So if there was no dedicated office, which many do not have, they were supposed to manage somehow. And Liz has already talked about the garage, and I've used that as an example. And so just what one respondent said: working from home was forced on me. I have no dedicated space. I work on my dining room table and therefore have to push my work computer over each day so my children and I can eat at the table. So that was a typical sort of response, people having to make do, but there was no consideration about that, and the fact that many people live in smaller and smaller places in apartments and have to manage with their children and so on. And some respondents mentioned the bedroom. They had to sort of edge past the laptop at night in order to get into bed and not look at their work piled up, and that it would upset them. But there is something of a class bias there, because usually professionals had studies, so lawyers and academics, but not many couples in heterosexual relationships had 2 studies. Some of them did. And we know that there was a significant increase in domestic violence, which I'm not going to talk about, but you know, it's one of the side effects then of working at home under stressful situations. And that stress, of course, is exacerbated when schools and daycare centres were closed. And so many respondents talked about how difficult that was to manage, having to care and to engage in homeschooling and to perform their paid work all at the same time. And some mentioned being exhausted because they had to look after a small child or children during the day, and they couldn't start their work until the evening. And so they were up half the night then doing their work. And this produced, of course, guilt, because they felt they weren't doing any either job properly, either their paid work or looking after their children. But it was still, in heterosexual relations, it was still women who were expected to undertake the preponderance of the caring and domestic tasks. So there was, you know, this term, the double shift, which dates from the early days of the women's movement, was, we see, revived. And so that the home was still seen as a feminized space, and that the women and the mother was someone who was interruptible, was going to be available for the children. And so as a result, sometimes productivity for those women with caring responsibilities did decline, while it increased for men. And this is actually empirically demonstrated by a number of studies involving academics and publications. So that the men's publication rate went up at the time and the women went down. And this has led some commentators to suggest that the pandemic then represented a backlash against women's rights. So that, that there was, it had a regressive effect on notions of equality. And of course, we know that in terms of the medical profession, nursing, aged care workers, and so on, which I'm not going to talk about. So working at home, the other thing that is interesting about it, there's no end to work. One is working constantly, no, because there's no separation. if you're working at the dining table and you don't know when it stops and you're trying to manage the caring work as well, where is the separation? What is the difference? There's no physical or metaphysical boundary. So you can't go out and drive to the office or catch a bus or do something different. You're there. This is the place of work. And there's no dress code. And so this is interesting. Well, there were lots of jokes about people in their pajamas on Zoom meetings. So I'm not in my pajamas. I'm in my office at the ANU. But one of the respondents said, well, to make clear that there was a separation so that she would dress carefully in her office clothes and then sit down and work at her computer all day. And at the end of the day, she would take off her work clothes and move into casual clothes so that she was creating some idea of a separation. But generally, work is everywhere. There's no respite. And some people described how they were folding the clothes or doing the ironing while they were listening into a Zoom meeting. So all those usual markers of time and place have gone as a result of this really erasure of this clear separation between public and private. Work seems to be endless. And so I'm interested in this idea of the prospect, and it could continue, of the economy actually colonizing private life, just as we saw with political life and civil society. So I think it's interesting that Marx said, but for the need to sleep, capitalism would expect workers to work 24 hours a day. So, and because workers have to sleep, they couldn't work 24 hours a day. But, the suggestion of working at home and that if that's what employers are requiring work to be done, regardless of what else there is, that's actually becoming the reality, the 24-hour-a-day cycle of work. So what about the future post-pandemic? Will working at home become the future norm? Well, it possibly will to some extent. There is a degree of autonomy and flexibility, which many appreciate, but there are the difficulties. So in terms of the survey, I think the figures are quite interesting because 88% of respondents were women. So, as soon as you see something about the home, asking people about working at home, the assumption was that, those requesting information might have been interested only in women, or only women would be interested in responding. And not only, there were a small number of male respondents, hardly any of the men gave textual responses, whereas many of the women did in quite a bit of detail. And so for the men, that 12%, the small number, it was just a ticker box, yes, no. So that's interesting as well about the cultural assumptions about the distinction between public and private life. The future, well, 35% said they would prefer to keep on working at home full-time, provided that there was childcare and the children could go to school. 24% preferred returning to the office. So they wanted the home to remain sacrosanct and to have that notion of a complete separation between the home and the office. Whereas 40% would prefer a hybrid system, so part of the time at home, part in the office, which suits many academics, I know. And of course, employers were also in favour. So in the past, and I'd done some work just a few years ago, talking to people who worked for corporate law firms, that partners were opposed to employees working at home said, how do we know she's not making a chocolate cake or whatever? So that there was that mistrust there because there wasn't the hands-on management. However, COVID did change employers' view about working at home. And quite a lot did work at home. Well, we know many actually lost their jobs, but you know, if you were working in a restaurant or whatever, you know, you obviously couldn't work at home. But 46% then of Australian workers did work at home during 2020. I don't know what the latest figures are, but anyway, that was sort of interesting. And also the productivity of some workers increased. So that was very appealing to employers, that they thought this would be a cost saving. After all, it meant that they could have a smaller office footprint and, you know, the hot desking and all of that. And so, you know, that there were all these plush offices lying fallow during COVID. So one wanted to take advantage of that. But there are sort of interesting questions about the legal status of workers. And we see an increasing propensity on the part of employers to have those working for them assume the status of independent contractor rather than employee. As an independent contractor, the person is then responsible for themselves and their future, to take out insurance and things like that. The employer is not generally legally liable, although there are debates about that. But I think it raises an interesting question. If you're home and you're, you know, carrying your chocolate cake and coffee or whatever up the stairs and you fall down, you know, is the employer responsible? Are you actually working or not working at the time? So anyway, there are issues that are ongoing at the moment. So these are the sort of questions then that I think that we might want to discuss, or I'm hoping that we'll discuss then. So, you know, what does it mean in terms of public-private dichotomy, you know, which is familiar within liberal theory, although it's not sort of set in stone. It does vary according to time and circumstance. But I'm particularly interested in this question as to whether working at home then has actually enabled the economy to colonize the intimate space by creeping in the back door. So that's happened, but, you know, it's difficult to resist. And, you know, what is the space one has to call one's own that's going to be free of management, of surveillance and so on. And of course, we have the issues about integrating paid work and caring responsibilities and caring for children, aged relatives, dependents with disabilities and so on. So what does all of that actually mean in terms of working at home? So another interesting, what I think is an interesting question that I put to you is that at present, then unpaid care work in the home counts for nothing in the computation of the gross national product. It's simply invisible, counts for nothing. So I'm asking question whether we should actually put a value on it, because if you're integrating caring work at home with paid work, you know, one is going to count towards the economy, the other counts for nothing. So would it be better to actually place some value in terms of the gross national product, or would that be counterproductive? Would that be sort of feeding into this notion of the economy colonizing intimate space? I hope we can discuss that during our discussion time. And so the final question then is that does the fact that caring is discounted perpetuate women's inequality? So, you know, that we're talking constantly about gender equality and what sort of things we might do to overcome the inequities that exist in terms of work and in terms of the home. And so the sort of beginnings of discussion of encouraging men to play a greater role in care and caring, which is quite problematic, I think, and there's certainly been some resistance to that on the part of men, because they're concerned, you know, in a neoliberal, hyper-competitive environment, that it's going to somehow impact deleteriously upon their future careers. But I might leave it to that at that, and look forward to the discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for your presentation. Extremely insightful about the history of work and the public-private dichotomy, and so much reference to your research over the years in relation to work. Lots of really important questions posed there, so hopefully we'll pick up on those in the Q&A session in a moment. So our third and final speaker is also one of the conference organisers, Emma Graham, and Emma's going to draw on her expertise and ongoing research to present on a very important topic of Australian mothers and job loss, rethinking the existing approach to measuring prevalence. So thank you, Emma, and really looking forward to hearing your presentation today.
Well, I would like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any other First Nations people who are present today. In 2014, the Australian Human Rights Commission released a report of findings from a national review into discrimination related to pregnancy and return to work. And as part of the national review, the Commission undertook a prevalence survey that provided the first available baseline data on the extent, nature, and consequences of employment-based pregnancy and maternity discrimination in Australia. And one of the headline findings of that review was that 1 in 5 mothers were made redundant, restructured, dismissed, or did not have their contract renewed either during their pregnancy, when they took parental leave, or when they returned to work. One of the key recommendations of the Human Rights Commission coming out of the national review was that the Australian government allocate funding to conduct a regular national prevalence survey, ideally every 4 years. This has not happened. And today I want to make the case that as we look to a post-COVID future and economic recovery, that now is the time to invest in designing and funding a second national prevalence survey of pregnancy and maternity discrimination. But if future prevalence studies are to be conducted and used as an evidentiary base to inform policy interventions, then the limitations of the existing prevalence measure must be understood. So in this presentation, I want to unpack what was both revealed, but perhaps more importantly, what was obscured by the measure that was used to capture the prevalence of discriminatory job loss for Australian mums in 2014. And in so doing, perhaps I'm picking up on the theme of Liz's presentation earlier about what's hidden in the demographic data on parenting. So there are 4 limitations that I'd like to highlight today. The first is that the existing prevalence measure adopts a narrow conceptualization of discrimination. Second is that it uses a narrow definition of what constitutes job loss. The third is that it obscures the role played by gaps in the legislative protections in exacerbating the vulnerability of some mothers to job loss. And finally, the existing prevalence measure obscures differences and levels of risk between mothers. So the existing prevalence measure was based on a series of survey questions that asked whether the participant had ever been treated unfairly or disadvantaged at work because she was pregnant, requested or took parental leave, or had family responsibilities. And the relevant responses that were included in the measure were dismissal, redundancy, non-renewal of a contract, or being treated so poorly that she felt she had to leave. And as you can see in the total column here in the chart, 17% of mothers reported experiencing one of those forms of job loss. But this existing prevalence measure is concerned for the most part with discrimination that is direct and individual. And that accords with how we usually think about discrimination, as existing on a linear thread that runs between the prejudices of an individual discriminator to the disadvantage suffered by the individual victim. But another important dimension of discrimination within a substantive equality framework is indirect discrimination, which manifests in the unequal impact of policies, practices, or rules, including maldistribution of social benefits, underrepresentation of certain groups in employment or representative structures, and institutional inequalities. So using the existing national survey data, it's not possible to measure the extent to which unemployment, non-participation or non-standard participation by mothers in the labour market is the result of either indirect discrimination or gender inequality. But we can seek to circumvent that linear thread that links individual perpetrators and victims of discrimination by expanding the relevant prevalence measure to include employment cessation that occurs when women become mothers for reasons that are ostensibly beyond the individual mother's control. So the question that was used to measure prevalence in the national survey was not the only means by which participants were able to indicate that they'd experienced a cessation of their employment. If we add to the existing measure those survey participants who resigned in response to discrimination or reported that they had not returned to work or did not plan to return to work at the time of the survey because their contract had finished or was not renewed, they were made redundant or their position was no longer available, they believed they were treated negatively or unfairly, they had been replaced, their job was not kept open, or they were fired, then the proportion of women who ceased employment increases to 1 in 4 or 24%. Another limitation of the definition of discrimination used in the existing measure is that it's focused on treatment at work without recognising the symbiotic relationship, as Margaret talked about, or tight embrace that exists between the home and the labour market, between paid work and unpaid care work. The existing prevalence measure does not adequately account for those women who are indirectly discriminated against because of the normative force of an ideal worker who is unencumbered by caring responsibilities. And nor does it account for those women who internalise an ideal worker norm and do not return to work because of the incompatibility between the normative worker and the work of parenting. So 7% of mothers indicated that at the time of the survey, they had not returned or did not plan to return to work, or they'd ceased employment because they couldn't find childcare or childcare was too expensive. They could not negotiate suitable return to work arrangements or part-time work or secure paid employment. Their working hours were not suitable, their working hours were too long, their workplace was not family friendly or flexible about child-rearing responsibilities. And if those responses are added to the previous measure, we find that in fact 28% of mothers, nearly 1 in 3, cease employment because of discrimination, employer-initiated job loss, or because of an incompatibility between paid work and caring responsibilities. The second limitation of the existing prevalence measure is that the conceptualisation of job loss as constituting only employment cessation is unduly narrow. It conceals the extent to which mothers experience negative changes to their employment arrangements that mean the job that they held prior to their pregnancy is not the job that they return to. So this table shows the percentages of women who reported being made casual or having their hours, roster, duties, roles, salary or bonus changed, or their position permanently replaced, as well as those women who, having returned to work, experienced negative differences in their post-parental leave job in relation to their position, their pay, conditions, status, area, or the quality of the work that they were doing. In total, 27% of mothers reported experiencing at least one of these changes. The extent of women experiencing what is essentially here a very broad definition of demotion has implications for significant policy challenges, including the feminisation of poverty, the gender gap in pay, superannuation, the motherhood wage penalty, and the concentration of mothers in insecure work. Of those mothers who experienced a negative change to their employment arrangements, more than half, 52%, ultimately experienced a cessation of their employment. That there is a significant crossover between these two measures of job loss is unsurprising. It affirms that discrimination does not usually manifest in one-off isolated events or occasional errors, but is rather part of a complex web of entrenched practices and the product of systemic disadvantage and social structure, to quote both Beth Gaze and Dominique Allen. For many women, cessation of employment will be preceded by the conferral of other cumulative workplace detriments that will ultimately result in either employer-initiated job loss or the mother's resignation. When both measures of job loss, cessation of employment and negative changes to employment arrangements, are combined, we find that 39%, or 2 out of 5 mothers, either lose their job or experience what is essentially demotion. And when that's weighted to the population of working mothers aged 18 to 49 years, this equates to over 100,000 mothers. But who are these mothers who are experiencing job loss? When prevalence is described as 1 in 5 mothers, as the Commission reported, or 2 in 5 mothers, as I'm arguing, we obscure those factors that contribute to the greater vulnerability of some mothers to job loss. So, for example, if we look at the intersection between job loss and the National Employment Standards in the Fair Work Act, we see that those mothers who fall into the gaps in those legislative protections are at greater risk of experiencing discriminatory job loss. The National Employment Standards provide 11 minimum entitlements available to national system employees, but not all entitlements are available to casual employees or employees with fewer than 12 months service. Of particular importance, I think, is that under the NES, women who've been employed with the same employer for fewer than 12 months prior to the birth of their child are not entitled to unpaid parental leave, and the commensurate right to return to their pre-parental leave position or a suitable alternative position. That minimum length of employment requirement applies both to permanent and casual employees, although casual employees face the added hurdle of needing to be regular casual employees with a reasonable expectation that, but for the birth of their child, they would have continued their employment with their employer on a regular and systematic basis. So looking at the prevalence data, we can see that both length of service prior to birth and type of employment contract are important drivers of discrimination and job loss for Australian mothers. So in these tables and in the tables that follow, I'm showing you 4 measures of job loss. The first is the measure that the Commission used, which was the discrimination question, and it included dismissal, redundancy restructure, non-renewal of a contract, and feeling treated so poorly that you had to leave. The second is the cessation of employment measure that I've designed, which includes the incompatibility of mothering and work. The third is negative changes to employment arrangements, and the final column is the combination of the cessation of employment and negative changes measures. So you can see that mothers with shorter job tenure and mothers employed under more precarious forms of employment contract, casual and fixed term, are more likely to experience discrimination as conventionally measured and to cease employment when they become mothers. If we look at this data in relation to industry, noting that precarious forms of employment are more likely in some industries than others, we can see that mothers working in female-dominated industries of health and education appear to have some of the lowest rates of job loss. But interestingly, half of all mothers employed on fixed-term contracts who lost their jobs worked in either education or health. So I think that demonstrates the importance of looking at multiple and intersecting variables to understand the nature of what's happening. The industries of retail, trade, accommodation and food services and other services, which are the 3 bottom rows. Other services includes personal services like hairdressing and day spas. They have high rates of job loss, and they also have high rates of casualisation, employee mobility, and a younger workforce. And I'll come back to age as an important variable in intersectional inequality and discrimination. You can see the correlation between high levels of job loss in the first table with access to parental leave in the second table. So on average, 60% of mothers access some form of parental leave in addition to the government-funded PPL, paid parental leave, such as unpaid parental leave, employer-paid parental leave, annual leave, personal leave, or long service leave. But less than half of mothers working in retail trade, accommodation and food services or other services had access to this type of leave. And that's as low as 25% of mothers working in accommodation and food services, which I think is in stark contrast to the nearly 80% of mothers working in public administration and safety who accessed additional forms of leave. So there appears to be a correlation between high levels of casualisation and employee mobility in these industries, with a lack of access to recognised forms of leave under the NES, and then a greater concentration of mothers at those intersections experiencing job loss. The number of employees in an organisation is also a relevant feature of discriminatory job loss, with those employed in businesses with between 5 and 99 employees most likely to experience cessation of employment. That these groups dominate is important, given employers of this size are currently exempt from the reporting requirements under the Workplace Gender Equality Agency Act, although I note that's been the subject of a recent review. Employer size is also relevant because the period of employment required before a complainant can access the unfair dismissal jurisdiction of the Fair Work Commission is 12 months for those employed in a small business, which is defined as a business with fewer than 15 employees, as opposed to 6 months for those working in a larger business. And the final limitation that I want to address relates to capturing data on intersectional inequality. So when we report the prevalence of discriminatory job loss by reference to mothers or pregnant women, it has an essentializing effect, rendering invisible intersecting axes of power and inequality and the higher risk to which women at those intersections are subject. One of the limitations of the existing prevalence data is that although the overall sample is representative of Australian mothers, when we dig into the data to look at the experiences of specific subpopulations, the sample sizes become too small to be representative, and the data is not weighted for those subpopulations. So for example, there were only 24 participants who identified as Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander, and only 41 reported having a disability. But of those mothers, just using the unweighted percentages, so you can get a sense of how many of those mothers experienced job loss, 1/3 reported discriminatory job loss as measured conventionally, which is twice as high as the weighted average of 17%. 42% ceased employment, compared with only 28% of mothers on average. Well, I say only, that's still a large number, but it's considerably larger for First Nations mums and mothers with disability. Where multiple and overlapping discrimination is obscured within the evidence base, the risk is that policymakers not only overlook intersectional inequality, but we actually design interventions in response to a benchmark mother that are not fit for purpose, and they're not responsive to the needs and lived realities of all mothers. So other mothers at greater risk of experiencing discriminatory job loss are young mothers, mothers parenting alone, mothers who are sole income earners, and mothers living in rural and regional Australia. Young mums were twice as likely as mothers aged over 25 years to cease employment, and 2.5 times more likely to experience discriminatory job loss as conventionally measured. Those young mums are overrepresented. I think somebody has their mic off in the audience if they're able to mute themselves. Oh, Anne, I think it's you. I'll keep going. Those young mums are overrepresented in casual employment, and they're more likely to have been employed for fewer than 12 months. So we can see those relationships again between the gaps in the NES and sort of other markets.
Right, for to make it so it's on top of each other.
Yes.
So you do.
Let's see if I can mute her. There we go. Done. Almost half of all young mums who lost their jobs worked in either retail trade or accommodation and food services. Young mothers were particularly vulnerable to job loss during their pregnancy, being nearly 5 times more likely to cease employment during pregnancy than mothers aged over 25 years, and 4 times more likely to experience a detrimental change to their employment arrangements. Similar intersections exist for mothers who parent alone or who are single income earners. They're nearly twice as likely as those in a couple or in dual income households to have experienced job loss as conventionally measured. And they're also more likely to be in casual employment, have shorter periods of job tenure, to work for a small business, and they're particularly vulnerable to job loss during pregnancy. Similarly, for mothers living in regional and rural areas, there's a significant overlap between other indicia of inequality, including age, disability, First Nation status, casual employment, and shorter job tenure. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that those mothers living in rural areas are 1.5 times more likely than mothers in cities and large regional towns to experience cessation of employment. Interestingly, for these mothers, access to services appears to play an important role. So 7% of mothers from rural areas reported that the reason they couldn't go back to work was because they couldn't find childcare for the days they needed, compared with only 1% of all mothers. And I think that also ties in with what June was talking about this morning in terms of investment in childcare in rural and remote areas, and how a failure to invest in that sort of childcare sort of was meant that inequalities were magnified during the pandemic and during lockdowns. So over the past 2 years of the COVID pandemic, we've seen the inequalities that exist in the labour market for mothers magnified. Women were more likely to lose their jobs during the pandemic, and the Grattan Institute have reported that this was because women worked in the hardest hit industries and occupations, they worked part-time, or they worked in casual jobs or had shorter job tenure, so they were ineligible for JobKeeper. In addition, the unpaid workload of care, housework and homeschooling increased during COVID lockdowns, and this workload was disproportionately borne by mothers. These inequalities in the labour market that exacerbated job loss for women during the pandemic are the same inequalities that play a critical role in job loss associated with pregnancy and family responsibilities. So the solution to the problem of discriminatory job loss that's most often recommended by researchers and policymakers is that a legislative prohibition on dismissing a woman during her pregnancy, parental leave, or within a specified period of her returning to work should be implemented. And that's an approach that's been adopted in several European jurisdictions. At first blush, this might appear promising. If 1 in 5 mothers lose their jobs because of discrimination, it makes sense simply to prohibit an employer from terminating a woman's employment during her pregnancy or the early stages of her motherhood. But when we use the prevalence data to examine the intersections at which discriminatory job loss appears to be most acute, we can see why such a measure on its own would be unlikely to resolve the problem. So first of all, if introduced in the Australian context, it's likely that maternal job protection legislation would be subject to the same limitations as other minimum entitlements under the National Employment Standards in relation to casual employees, employees on fixed-term contracts, and those with fewer than 12 months service. If this was the case, instead of reducing the vulnerability of mothers to job loss, introduction of job protection periods could actually exacerbate existing inequalities between those who already enjoy rights and entitlements under the Fair Work Act and those who do not. Prohibition on dismissal or redundancy is also unduly narrow because it would offer no remedy for the 27% of mothers who experience negative and often long-lasting changes to their pre-pregnancy role or conditions of employment, or to those mothers who are forced to leave their jobs either because of discriminatory treatment or because of an incompatibility between their employment and their caring responsibilities. It would not overcome the existing limitations associated with an individual complaints-based model, which I haven't talked about today, but which are well documented. And I note that fewer than 5% of those mothers who experience job loss actually made a complaint to a complaint handling body. So as this example demonstrates, the collection and analysis of prevalence data is a critical step in designing any policy or legislative interventions to address pregnancy and maternity discrimination. And I think the time to invest in that data collection is now, as we look to remedy gendered labour market inequalities as part of a post-COVID economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. A lot of confronting statistics there, and a call for the need really urgently now for this prevalence study to continue. Thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you to all of our speakers. We have a question that Margie Morrison has posted, so I'll just direct this to Liz as she's directing it to you, Liz. So how should or can better parent-focused data be collected, particularly from the 3 groups that you identified in your presentation? So I'll ask you that first part of the question, and there's a subsection B here that I'll ask you in a moment then, Liz.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Margie, and hello. How do we better collect it? Well, it needs to, we need to refocus the data collection. I think the data landscape or the data environment in totality in Australia, I think, was set and forgotten in the past, and we're not kind of revisiting and updating it as life changes. Certainly the ABS has done very well during the COVID period to be responsive and to get timely data out. The problem is that we're not seeing the investigation in those sorts of issues that matter when it comes to these sorts of data items that I've suggested. But the problem then becomes, well, whose responsibility is it? And who then, whose role is it to collect it, right? Certainly when it comes to First Nations Australians are oversampled, are oversurveyed, and the burden is huge. So there should be some way of considering the data landscape and considering what can be done and what ideally is the best practice. As Emma has said, now's a really good time to consider that. You know, we're thirsty for data. The general public has an interest in data because of the kind of, you know, we hang on for COVID numbers and things like that every day. Maybe not so much now, but there's definitely an appreciation of data, right? So I think now is the time. Now is a perfect time to consider the data landscape, consider what is flawed, what needs to be done. And of course, it's not just what I'm saying needs to be done. Emma's suggesting there are other data requirements as well. So, you know, the idea that we're not collecting the right questions is kind of fundamental to me. We're not asking about sexual orientation in the census, so we actually don't know the full extent of same-sex couples and parents. There's a lot of proxies when it comes to understanding ethnicity. We don't ask ethnicity, so we only know about ethnic diversity if you speak a language other than English, if your parents or yourself are born overseas. So we're not capturing a whole suite of people who are people of colour, but aren't seen in the data. Then when it comes to First Nations Australians, we seem to have very specific and specialised data that doesn't, we still don't understand about kinship and family and connection to language and to other kinship networks. There is a movement to see that in census, but what will happen to the census in the future is a different question. The data needs to be updated. The data needs to move with the times.
Thank you so much, Liz. And you've actually answered the part B of the question in your one answer, which is fabulous. Marian, thank you for that. Marian, you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. My question's to Liz as well. She mentioned in passing that there were serious defects in the time use data, and not to get her started, but I would like to get her started, as it were, because I know that in the 1990s, Australian time use methodology was regarded as kind of gold standard. And we've been campaigning for so long to get the time use survey back in the field, and now we've got it. Are you telling me that the data isn't going to be any good?
Yeah, the data from the census is, so the time use module in the census is poor. Why? We sit down and we do it with our partner possibly present, or someone fills out the survey on our behalf. So the head of the household or first person does it. What then happens is we see very little change over time if we look at the census historically. And we're probably not seeing a true reflection of the division of time. That's when it comes to census. So I would argue you need to get that out of census. It's almost like a module that's taking up, well, it's a module that's taking up space that shouldn't really be there. When it comes to a specific survey of time use, that's necessary. So, and I'm so pleased. What's so fascinating about the current time use survey is it hit the fieldwork time during COVID. And as a result of that, the ABS had to change the mode of data collection. And so we're actually going to see COVID impacts when it comes to time use. So in answer to your question, Marian, it's the census that's problematic, and any kind of omnibus survey that doesn't specifically look at time use on its own. The time use survey that the ABS has launched is very pleasing, but when will we see the data is another question.
Indeed.
Thanks for such a great question, Marian, and thanks for the response, Liz. That was really interesting. So I would encourage those in the group. Oh yeah, we've got Adrienne. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Thanks for it.
I'll even unvideo. Hi, that was a fantastic panel. So I'm looking at multiple screens. I really enjoyed all three papers and feel like I could ask lots of questions, but I'll do a question first to Emma. That was fantastic data, but it did make me think about, and I guess both yours and Liz's papers, that so much of our data is behavioural data and we have so little on sort of experiences and attitudes and answering the why around people's choices. And what I'm particularly interested in is what seemed to be coming up in Emma's data about the most precarious in our society being those without post-school qualifications and those entrenched in short-term contract and casual work. And you sort of were doing that sectoral analysis, which is also really interesting. But it's how do that generation of young people think and talk about and normalise those sorts of processes of going in and out of work and not having access to parental leave or to jobs after they come back from having children as well. So if you know if there's any sort of data or studies that are giving us a sense of how young people feel about that as well would be great. So, but thanks again, great session, great panel.
Thanks, Ariadne. I don't know of any, perhaps Liz does. So I might let her answer whether she knows of any other data sources about young people and how they feel about work now and parenting and, yes, mobility, I suppose. I guess I would just say in terms of that prevalence data and what I would like to see, like, I think it's difficult because, I mean, I touched on this a little bit, but when you ask people about discrimination and their experiences of discrimination, we sort of import our own lay understandings of what constitutes discrimination. And that can be quite narrow, and it sometimes, I think, can be what are the sort of most obvious forms and harms. Otherwise, what I found, because I've interviewed women for my research as well, they tend to internalize a lot of the blame around what happens to them. And a lot of them will, I think there's sort of a period after they experience discriminatory job loss of shock. And then it tends to be, what did I do wrong? You know, and so I think that's interesting to think about that psychology when we're trying to capture data on discrimination, which is why I think it's important to also capture just data on, you know, not whether you think what happened to you was discriminatory, but what happened to you? Did you cease employment or not? Did you experience a demotion or not? And then to capture the sort of multiple and overlapping indicia of economic inequality, which I didn't go into there, but I think that's missing. Like I was sort of able to look at the NES, and I'm not an industrial lawyer, but I could sort of look at the NES and see where it appeared that there were gaps and how that was related to the prevalence data. But I think other indicia of economic and structural inequalities missing from that. like, for example, in relation to housing precariousness, or mobility, labour market transitions, familial income and assets. We don't know the relationship between that form of discrimination and poverty, for example. So that's sort of a vague and maybe a non-answer to your question, but
it's a big topic, but no, it's great to see that you're doing the work on it. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks for the question, Ariadne. Apologies for my bad pronunciation earlier of your lovely name. Lovely to see you. Lyndall, you have your hand up if you'd like to unmute.
Thanks, and really thank Liz, Emma and Margaret for 3 really very fantastic presentations. And, you know, I got so much provocation from this idea of benchmarked mothers. I think that's gorgeous and very true. And it's a problem for policy and data, and it'll also be a bit of a problem in my own presentation. So Liz, you can go for your life when I come up with this. And Margaret, I just love the idea of endless work. It was just yes, and this kind of visual image of officers lying fallow. It was a really very powerful imagery you used. When I thought about the answers to your questions, I had yes, yes, depends on resources, no, and absolutely. So what I was curious about was this idea that, you know, June talked about we need to rethink work. So and all of you might have a view of this, but how would we rethink work in light of what we're seeing so clearly here?
I'm sorry, are you talking about paid work or unpaid work?
Paid work.
Yes, to be thinking about that in conjunction with unpaid work. Yeah. Well, I suppose I don't really have the answers to that, because, you know, we have this sort of set ideas, I suppose, that have emanated from the 19th century, and we haven't moved on very much, you know. So I think even, you know, things like data collection, we're talking about, you know, are set in the past. And so we're having to adapt. And because the pace of social change is so incredibly rapid, we haven't been able to keep up or, you know, to adapt, you know, these sort of, well, older or antiquated notions that we have about, you know, gender, about work, about unpaid work, about public and private, and all of that. So, you know, it's sort of racing ahead. So we haven't been able to think appropriately about how we cope with those things and how we combine them. I mean, of course, which is the topic of this, you know, this conference today. So I don't really have the answers, but I think, you know, that's what we should be focusing upon a little bit more. I mean, how we do that in a way that actually makes sense and doesn't then diminish and demean the caring responsibilities of the private sphere. But, you know, that we acknowledge that we live in, after all, a capitalist society, and, you know, it's about profits and profit making, and employers are going to see whatever space there is to move in and to colonize that, to maximize the profits, as they're doing now with the private sphere, which is sort of interesting, when that was seen to be off limits, really, for so long. So no, I don't have the answers. I'm sorry, I'm rambling here, but I'm, you know, thinking about that. And so hopefully the industrial relations experts this afternoon might have some answers about the way forward.
If I can quickly jump in, and I'm going to try and answer Ariadne's and Lyndall's question there. First and foremost, it's very solid in my mind that a national conversation, and I know it sounds cliche, about parenthood. We need to not remove gender from anything. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that everyone benefits from gender equality, and especially in the workplaces. So something at a workplace level that kind of considers the notion of parenthood and parenting, regardless of whether you're a mother or a father, that needs to be done. We need to be asking people, back to Ariadne's question, we need to be asking people what parenting looks like today in this kind of concept of a COVID affected world. And that necessarily means qualitative data. How do you negotiate parenthood? How can we better support you to be a parent? Because in the long run, we're seeing fertility decline, and that's a bad thing because people are not achieving their desired family intentions. Life is getting in the way, and oddly enough, we need to remove those barriers, and that means intervention from a policy perspective. So make it about parenthood, make gender equality more encompassing, and make it impactful in the workplaces, which will then filter into the home life, so that we're not seeing this kind of constant accommodation from mothers, because it's our time now to be accommodated, not for us to accommodate.
Well, what a phrase to conclude on. Thank you, Liz, and a real big call to action for those working in policy. Thank you so much to our fabulous panel, to Liz, Margaret and Emma, and to all those that posted questions or asked the questions directly. We really appreciate those and the discussion that we've had, and I'm sure this will continue on to feature in the other sessions as well. So I think we now have a break for lunch, so thank you to all those that presented and attended, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.